Greetings, Gilliam the Rogue here. I know I've been away for a while. I know a lot has been going on. The Morrowind PTS has dropped, and today I'm here to talk about the NDA lifted portions of the patch notes, which the entire patch notes are visible to anyone, so I can talk about those. And then the PTS itself, some of the stuff that I've been doing on there in terms of the non-NDA stuff, so the base game patches, that's free, not with Morrowind, I can talk about. And we'll be going in between the patch notes themselves and the PTS, aside from any Battlegrounds trials, any of that stuff. It's just going to be the baseline. So I know there's been a big uproar, and for very good reason, with this patch note, because the game is changing. Its core is moving away from what it used to be, which was very fast-paced, visceral gameplay, very, very high-end requirement in terms of performance. You had to be very, very, very good at the game to play it at its potential. And if you weren't playing at a sort of baseline, you were kind of outside of being able to participate in content. And ZeniMax is really trying to increase that floor, that baseline, so it's easier for players to participate in all of the game, and then lower the ceiling, which means the best of the best, that amount of skill that is required should come down a little bit. So the gap between players kind of gets smaller. You've probably heard a lot about it in terms of wage gaps and ceilings and stuff, so it's a pretty basic concept to understand, and it makes sense, especially in terms of a game, why they'd want to do that, because no one has fun performing or having to be some really good like esports level player in order to have fun in a video game, right? Like, people just want to be able to play, and then there should always be the opportunity to go above and beyond and have that reward. So this patch is really enforcing that aspect, because last patch, a lot of things changed with crit hit damage, group utility, and stuff to sort of lower the ceiling, and then they tried to increase the floor by giving buffs and a lot of homogenization in terms of taking away from unique aspects and giving it to everyone, sort of thing, so everyone has access to it. Now, I don't agree with how ZeniMax is doing this. I agree with what they are trying to do. I really, really, really would love to see everyone be able to play the game and experience the game, so it puts more pressure on ZeniMax to release better content. Because for the longest time in this game, there's been a lot of withstanding bugs and just performance of gameplay and an overall enjoyment that has been really shoddy due to in-game mechanics like one-shots in PvE, really toxic builds in Cyrodiil, performance issues, and so on. And if everyone was able to get into that content instead of being shrugged away because they're not really good at the game, then ZeniMax would have more incentive to tackle those performance issues and fixed balances, because it would be less about, oh, well, this is only affecting about maybe 100,000 people, that 1% versus our whatever 7 million copies or whatever it is in terms of player base. So if there's a larger system that more people are involved with, that affects more people, that incentivizes ZeniMax Studios to prioritize fixing those things. So I, again, agree with that. But this patch is trying to do that really, really hard, and it's going about it completely the wrong way. Now, not everything in this patch is bad. There's a lot of good in it. Some of it is not good or bad. It's more of just this really big change, and it's perceived as bad because everyone hates change, but that's not necessarily always going to be the case, as change is bad. It'll take some time to get used to, but we'll always find a new way to get over stuff, right? Like, every time they introduce some game-breaking mechanic change or whatever, the player base is upset, but we adapt. That's usually the case for most patches. Now, this patch, that doesn't seem to be as readily accessible. There are really, really big changes going on here that the player base was really unaware of. So this is going to tackle a lot of those issues, those pain points, as they like to call them, and try and alleviate some of those things, talk about them, what I would rather see done, what other people would rather see done, and so on. But that was a big intro, so let's start talking about the most important thing. And the biggest change was from Warlord and Siphoner. These weren't Warlord and Siphoner before. These used to be the old cost reduction from stamina and magicka abilities, and these used to go up to 16%. So it was a free 16% cost reduction that applied to your character regardless of what abilities you used, what armor you wore, and so on. So this was a really strong stat, especially for things like heavy armor, which didn't have innate cost reduction. So removing this was really good for PvP, because PvP's meta was everyone wears heavy armor because it was really good offensively, it was really good defensively, and it was actually better than medium or light armor in terms of holistic resource management, because it gave magicka and stamina back. And then with that cost reduction, you didn't have to worry about casting abilities as much, because you had this free cost reduction in your system. So removing that helped PvP a lot and kind of broke away from that everyone wearing heavy armor meta. So we're going to see more builds running light, more builds running medium. So that's good for the game, because that means diversity, that means more builds, and an easier system to balance, because there are going to be more checks and balances in terms of this build is really good versus this, but this counters that. So that's a good system, instead of just having, here's this really good build, it beats everything else. So really looking forward to that. But at the same time, this hurts PvE, especially tanks, because tanks usually wear heavy armor, especially newer players. You don't have to wear any of these. You can wear light, you can wear medium as a tank if you're really good, because of the way that the game is working on live. Now, next patch, that's not going to be the case, because a lot of things are changing. But this is going to really, really hurt tanks and make it even harder to do so. There are also some really nasty changes to block in terms of how much stamina it consumes. I'll talk about that a little bit down the line. But this really hurts PvE for tanks, DPS, and healers, but especially tanks, because they wear heavy armor, so they don't have that built-in cost reduction to their skills, so they're cost more than a DPS. And then it hurts DPS a lot too, because they cast abilities off global cooldown, which is this soft cap in terms of you can only use one ability every 1 second in this game. And this fits into the game's priority system. This is a very convoluted subject. Things like light attacks, bashing, blocking, those are outside of the GCD system, and that fits into the priority system, where each action has a priority on a list, and if it is higher than another, it will override that. But abilities all share the same priority, so an ability cannot override another ability. There are a little bit of hiccups in here with queue systems in terms of casting and whatnot, but generally you can only cast one ability every 1 second. So if I mashed my 3 attack, which is surprise attack right now, let's change that. If there were no global cooldowns, then every time I press the 3 key, it would go off. But the fact of the matter is there's a global cooldown that says, hey, you've casted this within 1 second, you cannot cast it again. So here, I'll just mash as fast as humanly possible. You can see my 3 key repeatedly going down, but it's only going off every 0.9 to 1 second. So this is referring to that global cooldown. This hurts DPS in terms of this removal of cost reduction, because we cast abilities off global cooldown. So when cost reduction removes the cost of each ability, that means the more and more we press it, the more effective cost reduction becomes in terms of resource management. Because let's say I save 200 stamina from my surprise attack. If I do that once or 2 times in 2 seconds, that's saving me 400 stamina, and that becomes an equivalent of 400 stamina regen. And if we look at enchants, cost reduction usually is more powerful than regen, because it only applies when you enact a global cooldown. So this is 203 from reducing stamina cost. So that means it's saving me about 406 stamina, ignoring diminishing returns. Obviously, it's not going to be the whole number because the game is convoluted. There's a lot of things going on. But then if we look at a different enchant, which is recovery, let's find stamina, regen, make that gold, and it's 169 stamina recovery, but you only get 169 stamina every 2 seconds. Now this will be applied by amplifications, but just looking at them, we see that cost reduction is much more efficient, more than double the power of regen if we are enacting that cooldown. So removing that from CP really, really hurts. Now, is it going to be the end of the world? If this was the only change, no. It would hurt PvE a little bit, but there would be easy ways for good players, teamwork, and so on to get over it. You don't need this cost reduction. I've done VMA on accident with 0 cost reduction because I use CP for a tank or a Magicka build on complete accident. You don't need the cost reduction. It definitely helps. It makes things easier, but you don't need it. There are other ways and systems in the game to get resource management back. So if this was the only thing that happened on this patch, we would be okay. It would help balance in Cyrodiil because heavy armor would be disincentivized because they would need more regen and they wouldn't be able to go as defensive or offensive. They would have to focus more in regen if they wanted to stay in heavy armor, or they could have the option of medium or light instead. So it would promote choice making or diversity. So that would be great. But the fact of the matter is this isn't the only change. There's a lot of other really big systems due to the other major part of the change of this patch. And that's resource management. So let's go find that. It's gonna be a little bit down here. Resource recovery changes. So combat in ESO has always been about fast-paced action where resource management plays a large part in performing effectively. Yes, 100% yes. ESO's combat has always been one of the best systems, and in my opinion, why it lived its rocky launch, because it's a very rewarding system. It's fun to play. You can do it for hours. There's so many cool and interesting ways to manipulate that system in terms of the priority system and making cool builds that might not use it or might utilize it wholly and so on. So that's a really, really big focus of this game is fast-paced, visceral combat. Very, very risk-reward, making many choices as you play the game. Now, at the same time, this also hurts the overall community because not everyone can do that. So I can see you wanting to kind of retract a little bit from that system, but the way that this is going to be done, which we'll talk about, isn't going in the right way. I would have preferred to see a system enter the game that kind of brought up the people who weren't able to perform at the same level in terms of using every skill off a global cooldown and doing these intense concepts like animation canceling, weaving with 100% accuracy, and so on. So rise them up instead of hurting the ceiling so that they have the ability to reach this potential, but if they don't want to go try hard, that gap instead of being from here to here would be like here to here. So there would still be growth, there would still be reason to be good and reward good players, but at the same time it wouldn't be like, oh, I'm down here and here's vet hard mode Maw of Lorcage. I will never do that because I'm not good enough. So if they bumped up the system in terms of a mechanic or whatever, this could have been a much better change. But instead, what they decided to do is totally annihilate resource management in this game. So there were a lot of skills and passives that worked based on your maximum resource pool. Things like spear shards that returned 20% of your stamina when you synergized. Things like orbs, which restored 1% of your magicka every second for 10 seconds, multiplied by the number of allies or enemies hit. Redguard Adrenaline Rush, which restored 1% of your max resource, which was stamina. Undaunted Command. There's a lot of systems that looked at the percent resource management or percent resource pool, so magic, stamina, and health, and rewarded you based on a percent. Now, the reason why this was good was because it enabled you to spread your points out. So instead of going full crit or full weapon damage, you want some crit, you want some weapon damage, and you want some stamina so that you can spend skills. And so when you enact those things like Undaunted Command or Spear Shards, that you get a more potent effect out of them, because if you have a higher resource pool, that 20% becomes much more larger. So it was this big incentive and build diversity in terms of like, all right, you need to have at least this much stamina or magicka or whatever to make use out of these. So that was really good. Now, what was the bad part about this? Well, CP gives you flat resources. So the stronger and more CP we get, the more warped and gapped, like the larger the gap between these things grow, because the higher CP you have, the more resources you have, meaning the more efficient these things become, on top of the ability of wearing gear, of having abilities, of being a race. So every time CP increases, our resources increased, and we got even more efficiency. So if we removed maximum resource from CP growth and kept it only into gear, racials, and class, then it would be a much tighter system that wouldn't have this exponential growth that, oh, the longer you play, the more and more powerful you become, until you reach this point where it's like, why would I ever take weapon damage when stamina gives me more damage, more resources, all of this? So if we remove that, that would be a really easy fix. But instead, they just say, nope, we're going to give everything a flat resource return. Cost reduction and recovery passives. A lot of these used to operate by giving a lot of cost reduction. So like armor passives used to give like 3% cost reduction per medium or light armor worn. This has been now bumped down to 2%. So you're getting less efficiency out of cost reduction. Same thing with recovery. A lot of per armor worn pieces got reduced by 1%. Now, the recovery nerf isn't a big deal because recovery doesn't stack multiplicatively. It stacks additively, and it applies to a base resource pool or a base regen pool. So if I have three things of resource or recovery percent amp, so one 10%, another 10%, and another 10%, if I applied that to the 100, it would be 100 times 0.1 plus 100 times 0.1 plus 100 times 0.1. And each of these would be in a parentheses. So it would equal 130 because those 10% would add up additively to apply to the 100. So 100 times 0.3, which is 130. Instead of being 100 times 1.1, which would become 110. And then that pool would be multiplied by another 10%, which would be 121, which would then be multiplied by another 10%. So it doesn't operate like that. It applies to the base. So percent recovery isn't a good stat because it applies to your base regen instead of your whole regen. So that nerf wasn't bad. It was meh. It was whatever. But the cost reduction one hurt a lot because that, again, worked by using skills which can move outside of the recovery's hard limit of one resource return every 2 seconds and come in the form of every time you enact a global cooldown, you are saving resources. Another big one is group-based buff and synergies. This refers to a lot of things like spear shards, repentance, orbs. These three skills alone were the pinnacle of raiding and dungeon performance in endgame because they enabled so much resource management. Shards or spear shards gave 20% of your stamina back every 20 seconds because that was the internal cooldown. So if you synergized, you get 20% of your stam back plus the Undaunted command, which was another 6%, plus a flat like 1800 over 10 seconds. So it was really strong. And then things like orbs, which were on its own 20-second cooldown, restored 1% of your magicka for every target you hit or ally hit, depending on what morph you took, every second over 10 seconds. So these two skills were really, really strong. And then repentance restored a flat amount of stamina based on your healer's maximum resource or whoever was casting it. So these things combined enabled for infinite resource management in PvE. Now the reason why it wasn't in PvP is because this system is based on control or having control of your surroundings. So these skills were really strong when you were controlling environments. So when you were in PvE, because a boss isn't going to be able to think like, oh, if I move out of his red circle, I will take no damage. No, he's going to focus on your tank and he's going to sit wherever he is. So you are in control. So you can control when you throw shards, where your group needs to be, and so on. But in PvP, you're not fighting an entity that is only based on rough calculations that are based around your actions. They are based on another human being, which makes their own reactions. This is obviously basic stuff that you don't need me to explain, but you lose a lot of power from these things because you lose control. So you can't sit there and throw out orbs and expect your entire raid of people in Cyrodiil to hit the synergy, because they're going to be getting wailed on. Your healers are going to have to heal instead of throwing resource management. You're not given the luxury that you are in PvE to control your surroundings. So these synergies were very powerful, but only when you maintained control. Furthermore, if you didn't maintain control and a raid became really difficult because mechanics didn't allow for it, like everyone has to split up, or your healers start dying because too much damage is going out, you lose that infinite resource management. It immediately becomes null and void the second you lose control. And why this wasn't really used by all of the population was because not every group is capable of having complete control of their surroundings. A lot of non-endgame raiding guilds have a very difficult time with teamwork and group synergy because they don't have very precise communication. A lot of people are learning the game still instead of being at their peak. So this infinite resource management that ZeniMax has kind of said, oh, hey, you always have this, is a complete bullshit lie, because it was only there in the top 0.1% because it was based around you having control. So removing this really hurts everyone, not just the 1%, but everyone else who is already having a hard time with resource management will have an even harder time with resource management because these skills have been nerfed. So the few times they were able to utilize them have been reduced because they now share global cooldowns, they give less resources, and so on. Next is resource spend and gain rates. A lot of skills had their own tier, so to speak, of resource. So if you used a spammable or a cast time, things like cast times had very high resource drains because you could only cast them once every 1 to 2 seconds. So if I casted Snipe, there's a 1.1 second cast time on it. So I can have a higher cost to it because I can't animation cancel it and get in some other stuff with it. So it costs more because at the same time, it's saving me resources as opposed to just spamming an instant cast ability. Then instant cast abilities had a rough baseline of about 2,500 or so with cost reduction and stuff. Obviously could be brought down much lower, but these skills were assuming you were casting it once every second or roughly 1 to 1.5 seconds. So these had the mid-range. And then finally were damage over time abilities, and these had very, very low costs because they went over a very long duration. So instead of getting this massive thing of damage, you had to apply it and then let it build up over duration. So instead of getting instant gratification, they don't want to drain all of your resources, because if you cast an ability and you get a resource drain, if you're not getting instant damage out of it, you're like, why would I waste my resources on this ability? If I have to let it sit there and grow in power and have the potential to be purged or removed, then that cost shouldn't be as high. So damage over time functions had less cost associated with them than many other instant casts or buffs, because they required that ability to ramp up to make it worth their cost, their operational loss. If I cast a 5,000 cost ability and it does 1,000 damage, I gained 1,000 damage for 5,000. But if I use another 5,000 ability and it does 1,000 damage over 4 seconds, Well, if those 4 seconds don't come by, then I lose efficiency out of that 5,000, and my rate or operational value decreases. So that's why they made those smaller. Now those have been increased. Almost all abilities cost the same amount of magicka, stamina, whatever. This really, really hurt DPS rotations in particular, because a lot of our abilities go between buffs, damage over time, and instant hits. So when you equalize all of them, instead of having this large system that says, okay, I have really cheap abilities, I have mid-tier abilities, and I have expensive abilities, well, if I add them all up, they equalize to a base average. But if I have things that are pretty spendy, slightly more spendy, and slightly less spendy, well, I add those 3 up, and now they're slightly above what that minimum or that average used to be. So everything just costs more now. And furthermore, things like damage over time and buffs, if they're not able to get their full value off over the duration, you have just incurred a large operational loss because you spent the same amount of resources but got less of a value out of it. So those are the bulk of the things. We'll look at more math in a little bit in terms of how comparing live to PTS costs in terms of non-Morrowind stuff. So we'll look at that in just a sec. So here we are on the live server. We are going to be taking a look at ability costs and talking a little bit about the current state of resource management, as well as giving a little bit of a look, mainly looking at solo play, and I'll be talking about how that transitions into group play and stuff. But a lot of these resource changes don't really hurt group performance as much. I mean, resources in Morrowind PTS currently are abysmal comparatively to live. But in really groups, and assuming the player knows what they're doing and can sort of alleviate some of these things, it's not that big of a deal, but it does have large implications on DPS. But again, this is more so talking about direct comparison of resource management and solo performance, not assuming crazy things like Vicious Ophidian proccing whenever you get a killing blow, because that doesn't always happen, and that's just one part of the massive puzzle. So I'm on my Stamina Nightblade, and let's look through some of my abilities as for cost. So there's 2 main things that we'll look at. If we're taking the Maelstrom route, we're not going to be running 5-piece Vicious Ophidian, meaning we're not going to get a built-in 8% cost reduction to our abilities. So that's the main thing to look at here. And our main spammable costs about $14.75 with this. Pretty cheap. In all honesty, it's a very cheap spammable, and it's because I have CP, I have 5 pieces of medium armor, I have lots of cost reduction built in, so this isn't that big of a deal. Next is Rending Slashes. Rending Slashes is on that tier that deals with damage over time. So since it operates over a duration and has the potential to be mitigated in terms of efficiency, it costs very little. Almost half of our main spammable, because it requires a 9-second duration to get its full value, while our spammable only takes a 0.6 or 1 second duration to get its value. Relentless Focus is a buff. It's going to last longer in terms of efficiency, so it empowers us for a duration. Usually buffs are going to be your most expensive, buffs and really long lasting abilities, then your spammable will be underneath that, and then dots will be underneath that. So spammable $14.75 we talked about. Killer's Blade $1,079. It costs less because it's an execute. You can't always be casting it. It's meant to be cheaper because it's not something you can use whenever you need. So it's a little bit less than our main spammable, a little bit more than a dot. And then another buff, Deadly Cloak. It lasts 15 seconds, and it gives us damage over time and a buff in terms of reducing damage taken. So it costs a lot more, $2,064, because it does a lot instead of just dealing damage or buffing us. Next is Rearming Trap. Rearming Trap costs about $2,000. Again, that's because it's going to do a lot for us. It's going to be a buff, it's going to deal damage over time, and it has that added bonus of snaring an enemy. Now that can be redundant in PvE, but still, the skill is loaded. It has a lot in terms of what it does, so it costs more because it enables more. Poison Injection, $13.27. Again, as a dot, it's going to cost less. The reason why it doesn't cost as much as, say, rending slashes is because it has an initial hit associated with it, which you can spam as a pseudo-spammable. So poison injection costs a little bit more, but again, a dot costs cheaper because it requires a duration to activate. Next is Endless Hail. Costs roughly the same amount as a spammable. That's because it lasts about 10 seconds. And it's going to be an AoE. So instead of just being this single ability that you cast, it's going to have multiplicative growth in terms of how many enemies sit inside of it. So it's going to cost a little bit more than just a basic damage over time or spammable function because it has the capability to become more efficient. Next is Caltrops, the highest cast skill in the game for stamina builds. That's because it lasts 30 seconds. It lasts really, really long, and it has an initial hit. It has a snare. It does a lot. So Razor Caltrops is going to cost a lot on live servers because it doesn't require as much casts. Other things, you cast every 10 seconds. So 3 Endless Hails for every Razor Caltrops. Guess what? Razor Caltrops is 5,700 stamina. That's pretty reasonable in terms of what it's doing. Next is Siphoning Attacks. This actually costs Magicka on the live servers. This is really good because we have no need for our Magicka if we don't have this ability there. So if I take this off, none of these abilities cost Magicka, so I have no reason to have a Magicka pool. So it kind of takes away from the Elder Scrolls experience where all 3 of your resources are important for something. So in Morrowind, this is going to change to go to a stamina only. It'll be a different morph for stamina, but it doesn't make sense. It makes Magicka redundant for us, and it hurts like the importance of resources. And it also hurts DPS for the Nightblade in particular, which will be for a further video talking about class balance. This is just talking about CP and resource management. So if we look here, Siphoning Attacks costs 2619 Magicka. It lasts 15 seconds. And the reason why this costs a little bit more is because A, I don't have a lot of Magicka cost reduction because I'm not in light armor, and 2, because it gives us resources back. So it costs resources to cast, but it enables extra resources to be gained out of it. So every time we deal damage with a light or heavy attack, we gain 1090 Magicka and stamina flat. You can light attack once every 1 second. So in effectiveness, you're gaining 2,180 Magicka and stamina regen. Now, other classes, it's pretty much the same. Dots cost less, spammables cost slightly more, and then long-lasting dots or buffs cost the most. For Magicka, a lot of times their dots are similar to the spammable because their dots are AoE dots. So that kind of increases their cost a little bit, but if you look at it, you'll see pretty much the same stuff. A lot of costing abilities. Let's look at my stat sheet to just kind of get an idea of what I'm doing. I'm in 5 Twin Fang, 3 Vicious, 2 Veladreth. I'm running 5 Medium. And then again, if I run 5 Vicious and drop Maelstrom, I gain another 8% cost reduction, and my abilities go even further down. I go to 647 Rending, 1397 Relentless, 1293 Rapid, 978 Killer's Blade, 1810 Deadly Cloak, and then my back bar doesn't matter because I lose Vicious Ophidian when I swap off of that. But if I were to keep it on my armor, all of these would cost another 8% less, probably closer to 6% or so because of diminishing returns. But that's with 3 weapon damage enchants. And now let's look at what just removing cost reduction would do. So if the cost reduction change were the only thing to go through, and I put it into, let's just say 100 into Mooncalf, and then the other one that we'll be using is Tenacity next patch. So let's just do that. My abilities, assuming non-Maelstrom first, jump to 878, 1836, 1755, so almost 200, 300 increase. 1285 Killer's Blade, 2457 Deadly, 2457 Rearm, 1580 Poison Injection, 1756 Endless, 6,885 Razor Caltrops, and then again 2619 for Siphoning Attacks. So the cost reduction is important, but it's not the end of the world, because if we look here, or let's put on my other spammable just to get a better one, because this actually costs more than rapid strikes. So let's just get an idea of what resource management looks like without siphoning attacks and without CP, just to kind of look at what it would be like if Nightblades had their siphoning strikes change and no cost reduction. So let's just go through the rotation. And you notice I'm starting to run pretty low on resources, but at the same time I'm still gaining a decent amount back. And this is solo, so I'm not activating 5-piece Vicious. I'm not getting killing blows to make Vicious stronger. And I don't have Siphoning Strikes active. But the second I activate Siphoning Strikes, I immediately start just skyrocketing in terms of resource management. And it's not even like to the point where it completely negates the importance of it. Like, I'm still casting abilities, they still cost something, but I'm able to stay afloat with my rotation because of siphoning attacks. Drink a potion, I jump to about 50%. Now I'm going to let siphoning attacks fall off, and my resources are going to kind of start to go back down again. So you see, when my siphoning attacks is off, it's a battle of slowly losing. But with siphoning attacks active, it's a battle of slightly gaining. So it's pretty easy to maintain resources if we are interacting with our buffs. And that was, again, with no cost reduction. So the Nightblade in live servers boasts really good resource management because of siphoning attacks. Now, in group play, I would have access to spear shards. That would help a lot too. I could put on 5-piece Vicious Ophidian. I would have even less issues with resource management. I go from that 1800 to about 1600. Abilities cost much less. So it's pretty straightforward to see that with siphoning attacks in place, removing cost reduction CP isn't the end of the world. And it's easy to see if we're not a Nightblade who doesn't have siphoning attacks, if we were to be in a group with spear shards or something of the sort, resource management would be totally plausible. And it would still be to the point where you'd have to be paying attention to it, and you'd have to ask your healer for shards or some sort of resource management or start heavy attacking. So it would still kind of prompt the user to be like, hey, you need to use your tools at your disposal to gain resources back. Now, in terms of the Nightblade, siphoning attacks is obviously really, really strong. And on top of having all of that resource management from the light attacks, it also has that 10% chance when dealing direct damage. So first hit of Poison Injection, first hit of Rearming Trap, first hit of Razor Caltrops, first hit of Rending Slashes, Relentless Focus, Surprise Attack. All of these things have a 10% chance to proc to get double that Magicka and Stamina back. It can only happen once every second, but it happens a lot. So the resource management of siphoning attacks is a little bit over the top. Now, what they could do is just remove that % proc chance and then just keep that 1090 Magicka and Stamina, or maybe even nerf it to about 600 to 900. You'd find a healthy balance somewhere in there of Magicka or Stamina back, and Nightblades would be able to sustain to some degree of, like, okay, you might have to heavy attack, you might have to find new ways, but it wouldn't be what it is on Morrowind. But now let's go look at Morrowind and see how bad these things are with the compounded changes of no CP, ability cost increase, recovery nerfs, cost reduction nerfs. So let's head over there now. So here we are. I'm logging into the Morrowind PTS in just a moment, but there was another thing that I mentioned in the live demonstration, talking about how abilities cost more. This is only for stamina. Stamina abilities used to cost 20% less than their Magicka counterpart. Now they only cost 15% less. So stamina abilities got a 5% cost increase across the board in Morrowind because of this new increased reliance on resource management as a big thing to focus on. So that was what I was talking about of the cost increase. Magic abilities did not get changed in terms of cost reduction as a flat line or as a baseline, but they will be affected due to cost reduction nerfs from things like champion point system and so on. But here we are in live. Let me head to where I need to be for my test environment. Other things while this loads is Minor Magicka Steel got nerfed from 400 Magicka every second to 300 Magicka every second. So the regen equivalents went from 800 to 600. So roughly 200 Magicka regen lost for Magicka DPS. This isn't going to be the end of the world, because Magicka Regen or Magicka Steel is still going to be very, very strong, but it will sort of tone down that insane resource management that Magicka builds currently have on live. And then furthermore, certain classes got cost abilities to go hand in hand. Since resource management's a big thing, some abilities cost too much before. So Dragon Knights, their whip cost 30, or their Inferno ability costs 33% less. This is a damage over time function. Lava Whip, their spammable, got a 10% cost reduction nerf or buff. And then a lot of other things is this flat level based on your character's level thing came through, and almost everything in the game now, instead of having a percent resource or a percent amp based on some coefficient, it'll now just be based on what level you are, you'll get resources back. And a lot of times these were nerfs. So like the only one that was a slight buff is Battle Roar. It's a nerf for DPS, but it's a buff for tanks, because tanks don't have the ability to just stack crazy high resources because they need health, they need a little bit of magicka, and so on. So Battle Roar helped them there. Helping Hands was a big nerf because most tanks had more than 19,800 stamina. So like Dragon Knights got somewhat of a cost reduction nerf. Nightblades got a massive one nerfed from Leeching Strikes. Again, we'll look at what it is on live or on PTS. If I open it up here, Leeching Strikes is now the stamina version. This is not max rank, but it now costs stamina, 1883 stamina at that, and I believe I have cost reduction enchant. So let's make sure that I have full weapon damage so that we keep the consistency in terms of comparison. So Leeching Strikes cost 2,066 versus that 2619 Magicka. Furthermore, it'll now give health back when we do light attack damage, but it'll only restore 384 stamina when dealing damage with a light or heavy attack. So we went from 1,090 Magicka and stamina back when we dealt light or heavy attack damage, with that 10% chance to get 2,091 or whatever it was, with direct damage, to only having 384. Now, in terms of regen capability, this is roughly 700 regen because you multiply it by 2. So it's not the end of the world, assuming you never miss a weave. The reason why I said roughly 700 is because you're going to be missing weaves unless you're a computer, because you're not going to be able to constantly do this off cooldown. If you have to do a mechanic, you're not going to be able to light weave. If you have to block, you're not going to be able to light attack. So it's not a, you can't look at just the numbers with it. You have to look at what's a rough estimate. So roughly 700 regen, which is still good, but compared to what it used to be with roughly 2,000 regen, there's a big gap in terms of performance. But again, the same gear set, so running 5 pieces of medium armor. I don't have cost reduction because there is none anymore. I don't have, let's put some points in here so I keep the consistency. This stuff doesn't matter. But rending slashes went from roughly 600 to 700 to 1620. Relentless Focus went from roughly 13 to 1500 to 2000. Surprise Attack went from roughly the same of Relentless to, again, 2000. Killer's Blade went from like 900 to 1000 to 1446. And Deadly Cloak went from that roughly 2000 to 2400 mark to 2835. Rearming Trap went from about 2400 to 2800. Poison Injection went from 1300 to 1800. Endless Hail went from 15 to 1700 to 2600. Now the one thing that did help was Razor Caltrops went from about 6k to 3k, but that's because Razor Caltrops now lasts 12 seconds instead of 30 seconds. So in terms of cost, Razor Caltrops actually skyrocketed in terms of what it costs. Because before, it was that, remember that the most we saw without CP was about 68.85, but that was 30 seconds. So if we look at that duration, we take that 68.85, divide it by 30 seconds. So it costs roughly 229 stamina per second of its cast. Now we go from this 3,160 to 12 seconds. And it now costs 263 per second. So if we look at, if we multiply that by 30 seconds, that now goes to 7,900 stamina required to cast instead of 68.85. So Caltrops actually got a cost increase because it requires that extra duration, or because it doesn't last as long, it requires extra casts. Furthermore, that also will hurt DPS in terms of long term because you have to enact the global cooldown system, so you'll lose the spammable. Now, because of this, Razor Caltrops got a buff. We'll talk more about the importance of its DPS potential, but in terms of resource management, again, this was a nerf. So everything costs a lot more. And now that Leeching Strikes now cost stamina, Nightblades in particular lost the ability to use their Magicka pool as a important resource pool to pull from. Now it's useless to us because we have nothing in our kit as a DPS that's really worthwhile. In PvP things change and so on, but this is a PvE look for the most part at it. And it's not talking so much about class balance. I know I'm using the Nightblade as a basis, and they're arguably one of the worst classes due to these changes because we don't have innate cost reduction, and we got the shit end of the stick again after like another 6 patches. But this is affecting everyone. So let's go look at the dummy in terms of what my resource management looks like in terms of like a 30-second part. So before, we noticed it took a little while for my resources to start dipping. And then once I activated Siphoning Strikes, I started gaining it back, and it became like this like slow little boost where it would go up, 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 up. And then once it fell off, it'd go down, 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 and then it would go back up. So it was penalizing me for missing, keeping it active and keep light weaving. Now we'll look at what it does in terms of, okay, I'm going to keep up siphoning attacks, or I'm going to cast without siphoning attacks, then I'm going to activate it, and we'll see what it really does. So let's go in. I'm already at 50%, so let's drink a potion. I'm running low. Let's go activate Siphoning Strikes. And I'm getting a little bit of stamina back, but I'm still draining really, really quickly. And now I'm already out of stamina. Within 28 seconds, I'm out of stamina completely, even after applying Siphoning Strikes. So now let's do some heavy attacks. Let's get my resources back, and then look at what it would look like if I casted Siphoning Strikes from the start. Okay, let combat end so that FTC shows me how fast I'm going to run out of stamina. Okay, let's go in again. I'm already really low, even though Siphoning Strikes is up. Let's hit a potion, go back up. I forgot to hit Razor Caltrops, so my stamina is a little bit better off than what it should be. But I go back, and within 25 seconds, I'm out of stamina. Now, why did this happen? Well, it's because Leeching Strikes now costs stamina to cast, and it costs a lot of stamina at that. 2066 stamina, and it only gives 384 stamina back per light attack. So if we look, how many times do we have to hit with light attacks to gain an equal amount? So we have to hit 5 light attacks just to equalize with stamina. So that means if we're perfect, we'll have another 15 light attacks that we can enable. And we'll get 5,760 stamina back over those 15 seconds. So yeah, roughly 768 stamina regen when we look at that. But because that cost is there, that's not going to really happen. And since abilities cost so much, we're going to have to start heavy attacking, and heavy attacking is slower, so Leeching Strikes is going to lose out in efficiency. And resource management is just going to be complete fucking garbage. Now, we can look at what it'll look like with Vicious Ophidian, because this will give us an 8% cost reduction. This is going to help out a little bit, but let's look at how quickly I run out of resources. So, again, make sure I'm buffed up before, and let's go in. Get about halfway. Let's go fix that. And I'm already out of resources. This time it was 29 seconds. So we almost lasted 30 seconds with 5-piece Vicious Ophidian. Now, we can go one step above that and look at what it'll be like if we wear 7 pieces of medium armor. Because remember that that medium armor passive went from 3% cost reduction per armor piece to 2%. So we lost, if we're wearing 5 pieces, we lost 5%. If we wear 7 pieces, we lost 7%. So if I wear 5 pieces of medium armor with Vicious Ophidian active. Now let's look at it. I'll keep up siphoning attacks again 100% of the time. Drink a potion because I'm about halfway just from applying my buffs. And within 30 seconds, so it almost didn't even make a difference, really. And we noticed that when I first start the fight, I'm dropping to like 50% of my resources just for applying my buffs. And now that nothing lasts that long, that's a pretty big loss. So now we can go one step further and look at what it would be like if I had 3 cost reduction jewelry enchants. And see, okay, maybe we can sustain if we do this. And not, we'll completely ignore the massive DPS loss implication that this incurs with it. But let's just see, hey, maybe if I do this, it'll fix everything. Okay, now with 5-piece Vicious Ophidian, 3 cost reduction enchants, and all 7 medium. Let's look at ability costs. 978, 1316, 1316, 778. So almost as low as what they used to be. Remember, Rending Slash's lowest was like 600, and that was in 5 pieces of medium armor with cost reduction CP, no cost reduction enchants. So with no CP, because obviously we can't do it, but 3 cost reduction enchants, which by the way is stronger than the old CP system, much stronger. 7 pieces of medium armor. Now let's see how long it takes. Obviously we're gonna have to kill this guy because he's not gonna last that long, but okay, now we're going to do the same thing, keep up sifting attacks 100% of the time. We're going to see, is it possible to sustain solo with the new changes. So, going to buff up. I'm dropping pretty low on stamina. Let's take care of that. So almost a minute. So double what it used to be in terms of running out of resources. But that was with 3 cost reduction enchants, all 7 medium, and siphoning attacks up almost 100%. So yeah, resource management blows for no real good reason. Now in a raid, that would be sustainable if I have shards and I'm doing a few heavy attacks. But the issue is I've lost over 1,000 weapon damage when I'm fully buffed because of losing those enchants. So I've lost well over 3k DPS because of this. So there is no real answer at the moment for the old playstyles of the game. Now, I'm not saying there isn't a way to fix this in the game, because there are a few ways, but they're usually built around heavy attack builds, and those aren't fast-paced visceral combat that many players know and love from Elder Scrolls. They're slower, they're sluggish, they feel less skill-based. They're not, you don't feel like you're doing much. You're just sitting there holding your left click, maybe throwing out some dots, maybe doing some buffs, but it feels like a much slower game, and it's not nearly as rewarding as getting off your proper rotation and working at getting better at something. So in terms of negative implications for this, everyone's going to lose a lot of DPS, no matter how you look at it. Everyone's losing DPS. I haven't even gone into the other implications, which will be in a further video about interactions in this system of like what it's doing in terms of cause and effect, because that's something that ZeniMax clearly doesn't really understand to the fullest, because this thing has a lot of negative implications with these changes. And I understand it's PTS, but at the same time, why? You want to nerf resource management, so why not look at one thing and introduce that and see what its cause is? Okay, maybe that didn't fix it. Let's go into PTS. Let's add another thing. Okay, it's getting a little bit closer to what we're trying to do, but small incremental changes so that you can look at your cause. If anyone's passed science class in fucking 9th grade, you remember one of the most important things in chemistry or any experiment that you did in lab, and that was control your fucking variables, so that when you see that change, You know what's causing it, because the more conflicting variables that you have, the more corruption that can happen on your experiment and sway your results. If you have so many things that are in there mucking up the equation and changing interactions, you can never figure out what the root cause is, because there's too much in front of you that complicates and convolutes. So one thing at a time. First do CP, then do spear changes, then do this bullshit ability based on level stuff. Do it one at a time, not all at once. You can't learn anything from that. 2. These changes hurt the solo player and in the floor more than anyone in the game. The whole last patch was about trying to bring down the ceiling and bring up the floor. This tried to do that, but did the exact opposite. While it did bring down the ceiling's top potential, we will find a way to get back up, but it'll use systems that the floor can't use as easily. It's going to require teamwork. It's going to require understanding of the game and to be really, really try hard. Not everyone wants to do that, so the floor will remain. The floor has also been reduced because even when they try to do these things that the top 1% does, they can't do them. So if you nerf a system that only the top 1% can do, then that means you're nerfing the floor even further, because they were trying to do it and they were only doing it at like 30-40% efficiency with hitting orbs, making sure buffs were up 100%. So by nerfing those systems, you've nerfed the little bit of power they were able to draw out of them and hurt them even further. So the floor gets hurt and solo players get hurt by this. 3. This implication hurts PvE more than it hurts PvP. I saw a very well articulated forum post by Code on the forums. He talked about how the system in terms of balance changes works in PvP versus PvE. In PvP, when you nerf something, it hits both players because both of them are affected by it. While each class might be affected a little bit differently, things that go to base gameplay mechanics like removal of CP, if I lose 16% cost reduction from CP, my enemy loses 16% cost reduction to CP. So instead of having an imbalance now, we are now at an equal place. Yes, we might not be as strong as we used to be, but we're now both as weak as we are now. So that system is much healthier in terms of balance and implications it holds, and promotes skill-based gameplay and shows the disparity between player A, who's really good, and player B, who humps the meta and isn't good. So that's a good change. But in PvE, our player loses 16 cost reduction, a boss doesn't lose anything, trash packs don't lose anything, mechanics don't lose anything, so we're just at a complete deficit in this situation with PvE. Now, we've spent a year, 2 years, 3 years progressing as groups, to anyone who's been around that long, to get where we are today. Every patch, we adapt, we figure out the meta, we improve, we look for rotations, gears, etc., and we keep growing. But then this patch hits us and we revert. We have regression. Meanwhile, the content we're doing does not regress with us. It becomes harder because we are now weaker. So things that we've been doing for eons now become much more difficult to do for no real reason. Do they reward us more now? No. There's even less incentive to do it because it has the same shitty mechanics and reward systems associated with it than it did before, but now it's just harder. And I mean, that's another discussion, but still, like, PvE is getting the shit end of the stick from this patch. So that was a lot of negativity to come out of this. Now, does it mean that this is the end of ESO? No. Like I said, we'll find a way to get over this. Now, it might not be something that everyone can access, and it might take a long-ass time, but we'll get over it. We'll find something if we need to. But in terms of implications that this holds for the game, it's very, very negative. If these patch notes go to live in their current state, many people will quit. Now, is that a bad thing? Some argue otherwise, but personally, for this game, losing anyone, especially long-lasting players who have been a part of the community, who constantly interact with discussion, release builds, and so on, losing those people hurts the community on so many levels, and it's what they pose the largest risk of now. We've already seen Deltia leave. We've seen a lot of other people question leaving. Some of them may be toxic, some of them may be not. But the fact of the matter is that we're seeing a very negative response to these patch notes, and we need ZeniMax to communicate with us and respond to why these people are having these feelings. You don't have to spoon feed us bullshit and say, oh, we hear you, we'll fix it. No, we don't want that. What we want is actual discussion. When I go on the forums and I'm looking for answers, I don't get any right now. Sure, we get some shit like, oh, hey, it's the PTS, don't worry. Okay, that doesn't alleviate any of my frustrations at all. That just tells me that you're spoon-feeding me nonsense. It doesn't explain, hey, we understand why you feel this way, but look at it this way. What implications might these changes hold that you might not be looking at? Or looking down the line, we have bigger plans. This is a part of those. Like, engage in discussion. Talk to your players. Explain your reasoning in a way that's engaging with the community instead of saying, this is what we want for the game, this is what we're doing. No, that's not how you run a game. And I'm sure a lot of you have gone to school and don't need to be told that, but based on your patch notes, I think you could use a little bit of advice from now to now. The more ideas and opinions you get, the more well-rounded opinion you have and a better focus that you can look into it. No, I won't be quitting ESO. A lot of other people won't be quitting ESO, but a lot of us are upset and a lot of us are expecting change. And if those changes don't go through, it's going to have a lot of negative implications beyond what the damage has already been done. So this was just part one. There's a lot of other stuff to talk about, namely class balance or the lack thereof. There's also other implications such as the cause and effect of what these things do, namely with mechanics and tied into CP, some of the good that will be coming from these changes and so on. But this has been the most negative aspect, so try not to lose complete hope for the game yet. I mean, get on the forums, talk to the devs, do as much as you can, but keep it engaging. Keep it like real constructive feedback. Don't say, fuck you, you ruined the game, you're a piece of shit, someone should kill you. That does nothing. It just makes you look like a complete asshole. But if you say, hey, what the hell are you doing? These changes, what are you trying to do with them? Talk to us. Try and figure out what they're doing. Is it because they are implicating a new change that may have a lot of negative effects that if these don't go in, we have to do something about it? What is it? Offer feedback and explain your feedback. Show that you understand cause and effect to the point where it's like, oh, buff Nightblades by making surprise attack do 3,000% more damage. What does that do? Oh, it might probably hurt PvP because you'll be one-shotting people, or it might make Nightblades overpowered. So if you talk about your suggestions, also talk about the implications that come with them. Give real feedback, constructive stuff. But again, this has been the most negative aspect. In our other two videos, it's not going to be this negative. I'm not saying there won't be any negativity, but this is honestly the most difficult and jarring part of these patch notes is this resource management change, because of it has so much negativity associated with it, and it doesn't make any sense. We've been playing the game. The meta has always had infinite resources in it somewhere. Why remove it now? I understand that PvP is in a bad place because of it, but there are ways to fix that without implicating or doing things. Like I said, introduce one small change at a time, see how it works. If it gets closer to your end result, maybe add a few more things, but don't just fucking shovel a heap of garbage and expect to go find the cause for it, the cause of the nasty smell after, because it's going to be a whole bunch of shit that you won't be able to discern. So I know this has been long. Thanks for bearing it with me if you have, but hopefully this has maybe given you a few ideas to go on the official forums. Maybe this has reached a dev or two. I applaud you guys for your hard work, and I love each and every one of you, especially after visiting. I see that you guys care about this game, but reading these patch notes really makes me wonder what the fuck is going on. And I really hope that some sort of reason reaches you guys from myself and many of the other content creators and just players in general who are trying to reach out and understand what the fuck is going on. But until then, I'll see you guys around.